Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the April DAC meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. If everyone could look over the minutes from last meeting. A motion to approve made by Interschool. Okay, there's been a motion to approve. Seconded by
Ilya Cepeda, 3 Oaks Middle.
Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Okay, motion is carried. And now we will have public comment from non-DAC members about agenda items. Nothing? Okay. Now we will have, we'll have to skip over the board update from Mary Fisher. She hasn't quite made it in yet. So let's go ahead and start Dr. Atkins' presentation, and we can circle on back to Mary's.
Good afternoon or good evening. It's a pleasure to be here again. Just wanted to follow up. We've, I think, made some significant progress since we last met on the subject of safety and security in schools. So I did want to give you, just a kind of a brief overview. And in a moment, I'll introduce our new director of safety and security, Mr. Rick Parfit. But before I do that, just to give you kind of where we are today. As you are probably all aware, we have deployed SROs out, 40 additional SROs, thanks to the Sheriff's Department. And again, I really appreciate the Sheriff's Department and their willingness to literally step up to the plate and redeploy officers. That's something that is not costing us anything as a school district at this time. However, there is a bit of a consequence to the community overall in that they've had to be redeployed off of other responsibilities. So moving forward, our team and Mr. Deming, Mr. Parfit up here are integral in this process. They're working with our community leaders and other, with the county and also with our different municipalities such as the city of Fort Myers and the city of Cape Coral, to try to come up with a long-term solution in terms of how are we going to fund SROs moving forward. The cost of an SRO is significant. Total cost is about $103,000 per SRO, and that's a cost right now that is split between the school district and between the county, the Sheriff's Department. Again, the additional 40 officers, that's not a split. That's something the Sheriff has picked up temporarily, but that's just to get us to the end of the school year. Long term, this community is going to need to figure out a way to comply with that, with the law, Senate Bill 7026. So we are working with our community partners in the different cities and municipalities in the county to work out a solution. What's interesting is across the state, how SROs are funding is quite different. We have a 50-50 split, and other communities that split is very different. And there's other school districts that literally have their own police departments, but you typically find that to be the case in larger districts like Palm Beach and the city of Miami-Dade County. So, so that's an update as it relates to the SROs. Our project list for our capital plan, which is where we spend our capital dollars for buildings, infrastructure, and things like that, is being updated, as well as our project list as it relates to the half-penny sales tax, to reflect an additional emphasis on safety and security items, which Mr. Parfit can speak to when he comes up here. But again, we're actually having to reduce some other areas so that we can beef up the area of safety and security, which is a good thing. Single point entry is something that is high on the priority list, and single point entry means that you have really one way once a school is locked down, one way of getting onto that campus. you know, we're really working to get every school up to our highest school standard, which is really you have a single point of entry and you have you know, video and a door buzzing a person in and out of the building, which you see at some of our buildings, or many of our buildings right now, but you don't see in all of our buildings. So that gives you a little bit of a brief update, and I'll let Mr. Parfit fill in the rest. But before I bring him up here, just to give you a little bit about his background, he has a pretty extensive background in law enforcement. His most recent assignment is he was the Director of Safety and Security at Florida Southwestern State College, where he was for the past, like I said, past decade. And that's overseeing all campus security, and he also had to oversee if you had a major event such as Hurricane Irma. You know, he was overseeing that effort at the college as we were doing it here within the school district. So, and before that, he had extensive experience in law enforcement. He is the current president of the Florida chapter of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. Is that right? All right, I finally got that right. Which I think we're very, very fortunate to have somebody who has that level of experience and credibility enough to where professionals in this area around the state have elected him as their president, and that's the Florida chapter of a national association. So, so without further ado, let me bring him up here, Mr. Rick Parfit, our new Director of Safety and Security.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. As Dr. Atkins said, the safety and security climate's going to change, and unfortunately it's sometimes driven by tragedy. But I think the district has been moving in that direction, and I think this will just cause us to move maybe at a better pace because of the legislation, hopefully some funding from the state. But our plan is a comprehensive approach, because you'll hear me say this no matter how many times you listen to me speak, that we're not going to find a magic wand, we're not going to find a device or a security system or some piece of hardware that is going to fix this, that is going to make us completely safe. You know, we've discussed possibilities of all kinds of things, and I used to say it somewhat facetiously in nearly 20 years of higher ed campus policing, that the only way that we can make our campuses secure is we'd have to build walls and dig moats and things like that. And unfortunately, even prisons aren't that safe. I mean, there are cases where drugs and weapons and things like that are smuggled into prisons. If you see the news, TSA and boarding airplanes, things like that. So I don't want everyone to get locked into thinking that there's going to be some security fix by some device or system that's going to do it. And I think that the legislation is right on track with what we need to do. We're actually one of only a handful of states in the country that actually mandate threat assessment training for K-12 schools. And it's only been, surprisingly, even though these types of tragedies have gone back nearly 20 years, it's only really been in effect for about 4 years. Virginia was the first state, and it's only been about 4 years ago. And there have been a couple since Parkland that have added. Maryland is one of them, I know. But there are only a handful of states that have legislated this, and I think that as we move forward, you'll see that it's going to add an impact. And what I like to say is the basis behind it is not the technology piece, because that's always evolving. And again, as soon as we come up with a security system or a device that is going to prohibit, deny, or forbid someone, somebody's already figured out a way to get around it. Think of technology. And those of you that have children, the devices on cell phones and things like that. as soon as there's a way around them. You know, Dr. Atkins said a lot of experience. I think that means that you've been around a long time. I remember when harassment by communication was people breathing into a phone. Today it's social media, it's texting, and those kinds of things. So you can see that the technology, we're always going to be one step behind. The human element, the piece that you hear me stress repeatedly, is that we have to do a better job of educating folks, training people, and starting with kids. And because I think we've conditioned a whole generation out of it. I think we've conditioned people, and maybe technology has been part of that problem, that we don't recognize concerning behavior and problem behavior. And I think we have to do a better job of that, because we have to identify dangerous individuals before they show up, not when they're at the front door. And there is a science behind it. It's evidence-based, and we can do that. And the research is there in that regard. And I think it's truly, you will find it's the best way that we're going to protect kids. And it's not a magic cure-all, but it means everybody has to be a little more aware. And we have to, what we used to say, you know, unfortunately from tragedies, Virginia Tech, because I was in higher ed, Virginia Tech, the concept was, well, we needed to connect the dots. We failed to connect the dots, and people slipped through the cracks. And that was true, but we've since even continually found out that we're not necessarily failing to connect them, but we're not collecting them. If we don't have that information, so the information that we get, and I think the SRO programs are such a vital part of it, because those law enforcement folks that are in our schools build a trust with the kids there. They head off a lot of this. There's no way that we're going to be able to tell how many tragedies, how many types of violent situations that have been prevented. But there actually is some research. It's the Police Executive Research Forum or something like that. They've actually have a website where they are collecting that information of where they believe that certain tragedies have been averted, and it has been averted because of information, because the right information got to the right people and some sort of intervention took place. And that's the key to it, I think. Anything else? Anybody? Some of the questions that were raised at your last meeting have been answered. I think they're in your minutes. But if there's anything additional that you've thought of or you want me to follow up on, I'll be happy to do that. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Could you elaborate a little bit on the microphone? Hi, Dante Chaffee, Fort Myers Technical College. Could you elaborate a little bit on the interagency communications with different law enforcement in which you'll be involved and the SROs will be?
The communications has always been and probably continues to be somewhat problematic. One of the best things that we have, I think, with one agency in all of our schools is that we have one agency, that we're dealing with the sheriff's office, and communication amongst them is much greater than dealing with separate agencies for cities or different schools, things like that. But the communication does tend, and if you meet between law enforcement agencies in particular, unfortunately, law enforcement folks sometimes are provincial too, and that's a big barrier that we've had to try to challenge, and it has. We've worked at that over the years, all the way back from Columbine forward, with communicating that, and I think that that's going to continue. We have to continue to build those kind of relationships to share that information, and I think our SROs right now do that and do a good job of that, because they are forwarding information, because they're dealing with crimes, or information I should say, that they gather in the schools. But the information they gather may be different parts of the county, different cities, things like that. So they do relay that information. Hopefully that answers.
Just to try to, yeah, there we go. Just to try to also elaborate on some of what he's mentioned, we have continued to be meeting with the city of Fort Myers, with Chief Diggs, and Mr. Deming's letting me know that they have a meeting with the city of Cape Coral, Chief Newland, and he and I have also had several conversations. So, you know, again, moving forward, I looked that this is going to end up probably being kind of a multifaceted solution. We have had issues in the past. I think I might have mentioned to you about a situation in Dunbar High School that was multi-agency, that where we really didn't have the coverage that we wanted to, but we're hoping that with the pilot that we have at Franklin Park and Fort Myers Middle, that should be starting up here real soon, that we start to work out some of the kinks between, in that case, Fort Myers Police Department and the Sheriff's Department. As Mr. Parfit mentioned, it is much easier to deal with Sheriff's Department because the sheriff is the sheriff. He's an elected official, nobody above him. He makes the decisions that are relative to, you know, respect to his agency, and that's all there is to it. Chief Diggs has a greater challenge in that he has Saeed Qasemi, who's a great guy. I mean, I like Saeed. I know him personally because he had kids at my school when I was a principal. But he's the city manager, and then we've got a mayor Henderson, who also had kids at my school. But you got to deal with the mayor, you got to deal with city council, and so the decision-making process is a little bit more difficult, and Chief Newland has the same situation. So it does get to be challenging, but we hope that some of these pilots, you know, we're going to be able to work through and develop some good communications as a result. And let me just, and I'll end last, just give you a for instance. If you have a situation that occurs on the Franklin Park campus, and you've got two law enforcement officers, one that's a sheriff's deputy and the other that's from the city, then you've got some jurisdictional issues that we have to map out as an organization prior to deployment of both of those on that campus. You know, who's the arresting officer, who's going to be responsible for what. And so there's a lot of challenges, things I didn't even think about until you start talking to these law enforcement officers. They're the experts, but they also know, you know, what issues arise when you've got, you know, two agencies dealing with one incident.
Somebody in the back.
And you had a question over.
There's one already up.
Hi, Shelby Vick at Colonial Elementary School. Is there a role outline mapped out for an SRO in a school? Like what they are to do or to not do?
They do have some general guidelines, yes.
Okay, is that ever going to be shared with the school staff?
I don't think that it would be inappropriate to do that.
Okay.
I think that it's also covered by statute that and I can't remember the section in the education code that outlines basically how they work. It's just some general things, and the fact that they report to the sheriff, of course. Their boss is the sheriff, or if it's a police officer, they're the police chief. But as far as the maybe some of the duties that they have, they're kind of spread out between statute. Even this new legislation outlines some things that SROs, will do, some of the training and things like that. I would think that they do have something more comprehensive, more as far as a guidelines or a manual. I can speak to Captain Miller and see what information they put out. I'm sure they have something.
Okay.
Yeah, just to let you know, the Captain Miller has sent out the thing to all the principals, and I can get with the principals and make sure they go over it with their staffs. The key thing is that they're visible, they're not in an office, that they make sure they do rotations, but they do not have a standard rotation, because we don't want to know where they are at all the, you don't want people to figure out their patterns. But during lunch, they need to be near the cafeteria. Before school, they need to either be at the bus ramp or parent pickup. But they're given specifics. But they do work for the Sheriff's Department. And the Sheriff's Department does give the guidelines. And we've given a real specific set to the principals. And I'll make sure that that goes out. They get out. Also, Chief Diggs has a little bit different one, and we can get those to the two principals that's involved with, and we can make sure that all the staff knows, because all the staff, if you're worried, you should know what your SRO is supposed to do.
Right.
It's not like the old days. I know if you remember back
Alva
years. Well, you don't. You're too young, but when a lot of times they'd camp out in their offices and stuff like that. That's not the case. That's not what we want anymore. We want them circulating and be. We want them to be the center of attention.
Will you gentlemen be in the breakout sessions for further questions, or?
Yes.
Okay.
And just elaborate a little bit on what will be really kind of interesting to us is how the Fort Myers and the Sheriff's Department model interacts between the two, because you do have a little bit different philosophy between the Sheriff and Chief Diggs. One of the things that Chief Diggs is trying to accomplish is a community policing model, which means that you're going to see SROs that want to interact with students in schools, get to know them so that they can be a trusted source student. And just like in that way, they're very much like the Sheriff's Department. The difference comes that with the city of Fort Myers, they want to also have those deputies get very familiar with the neighborhoods in which those kids generally come from. So you're going to see a little bit of a community policing aspect. So not just interacting with the students, but also at times going out into the neighborhoods and working with the parents. We're hoping that may also help us with truancy, attendance, and also develop a trust there between not just kids and the SRO, but also the parents as well, so that when criminal activity, concerning behavior gets manifested, whether it's in school or out in the neighborhood, that gets reported to police officers so we can take appropriate action.
Casey McConnell, Tice Elementary. What we're talking about is this ramp-up plan for what's happening in the schools, and I just want some clarity for timeline that we're talking about what's going to happen for the next few years. Is there a timeline where it's going to ramp back down in the foreseeable future? Or is this endless? I'm thinking budget. I'm thinking next year if it runs out, are we going to immediately everything's going to drop off? I mean, is there a plan in place, or is there no plan and we can rely on this? And
I'll answer that. Try to answer that one best I can. We see this as something that we would like to do in the foreseeable future. Continue into the foreseeable future. Before this even happened, Sheriff Scott and I sat down to talk about campus security relative to our larger high schools. So we had already made a commitment that we were going to increase the number of SROs at our larger high schools because we didn't think the ratio was sufficient enough. The challenge, I will tell you, is going to be the continuation of funding, which is where I need your help because I really believe that we as a community have to stay engaged and make sure that this type of effort gets funded at the level it should be. And I'm not just including the law enforcement SROs, but I'm also including mental health, because that is also something. What we've seen due to a reduction in funding is we've watched the number of guidance counselors or school counselors, Mrs. Fisher will correct me on that one, school counselors decrease, social workers decrease. But instead, we've got a great example at Fort Myers Middle School where you have some staff there that is trained in mental health counseling and trauma, and so they can help our students every single day. We need that in more of our schools. I think I shared with you last time safe school categorical funding over the last decade. You know, more than a decade ago, it was a little over $2 million, and then this year it was $1.6 million, and we have 22,000 more students. Okay, so that's funding that we receive for safe schools. Now next year it's going up $2.9 million, but that's a direct response to a tragedy. We can't allow those dollars to go back down again, but we have to stay vigilant as a community and make sure that, and that means, and you know, I'm going to tell you I think I've told you before, I'll tell you again, we want to stay engaged and we want to vote and we want to be vocal and because we're talking about our kids, right? So, and I think if they know we're paying attention, if our policymakers know we're paying attention and we demand this of our schools and of our policymakers and elected officials, that we will continue to get things staffed that they are appropriated financially the way they should be.
Andy Erickson, Alva School. My question is, when you're talking about Fort Myers City Police, that they're going to work as in the school, and they're also going to go in the community. That sounds like overtime to me. How is that? Do you know how he's going to possibly work that out?
I think that his intention to work it out is that the officers would spend part of their time in the school and part of their time in the neighborhood. There may be some overtime involved. I noticed that the way they have their hours structured is a little bit different than what you might normally see in a typical, 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 environment. Having said that, the models that we're going to deploy will actually have initially is going to have a full-time sheriff's deputy that will be, and our deputies at the sheriff's department are at the school all the time. Okay, so that will continue at Franklin Park and Fort Myers Middle Academy, whereas the Fort Myers police officer is going to be an in and out situation where they'll be in the school part of the time to build the relationships, and then the other part of the time they'll be in the community.
Hi, Lori Fahey, Cypress Lake High School. My question is falling on the mental health workers also, and I'm curious, I know the school counselors are not mental health providers, and from what I was reading, we only have 50 or 60 mental health workers in the district. Does this safety plan include increasing those numbers? And is there a path so that our SROs will get the mental health workers involved so that they can work on this? We've had a bullying situation, and I never know what the protocol is on that, on how they get the mental health workers there. Was that too long of a question?
Yeah, no, that's fine. If you want to start or no.
I can address the idea that matter of fact, one of the things with the SROs where the legislation is updated on this point is that they all have to be what they call CIT trained, crisis intervention trained, and it's a 40-hour block of training that covers not just mental health, but even developmental issues, things like that. The mental health part is a key piece of this legislation too, because it requires that the district provide training, and we've already been speaking with Soretta
Ralph, yeah,
and her folks getting the psychologists, the social workers and things like that, because we're going to have to come up with a plan to train not just staff, but even students in mental health awareness. It's going to be a big part of it, yes.
So as we move forward with looking at reviewing not only Senate Bill 7026 and the implementation plan for that and the additional dollars that we have assigned as a result of that piece of legislation, but we're also right now in the process of formulating our FY19 budget for next school year, and part of that is going to include increasing the allocation in that area in terms of mental health. So as we move forward the next month, 2 months, we can get more of that type of information to this group, so that you know a little bit more specific information, in terms of numbers. I don't have that for you today, but we can certainly, get that for you, because we're literally right now, it's actually a great time to ask the question because we're in the middle of that process, as we speak. In fact, Mr. Blurton, our CFO, gave our chiefs an update about our budget just today. Unfortunately, it wasn't great news, but he did give us an update.
Scott Hertz on Gulf Middle School. I understand, Dr. Atkins, you mentioned that you have meetings upcoming with the Cape Coral Police Department. I guess one area of concern I would have about Cape Coral is the Sheriff Department has a very limited presence, generally speaking, in general law enforcement in the Cape. And so I'd be curious, too, to hear about or to know that you're developing protocols that are going to work on that, making sure information shared, because there's not a lot of other, besides the school resource officers. I mean, the first time I pulled in the school and saw the sheriff's car, I was kind of thinking, what are they doing here? Oh yeah, SROs, because you just almost never see sheriff vehicles in Cape Coral. So I was curious about that, since the Cape Coral Police Department does provide the rest of the law enforcement in that area, how that's going to interplay.
Well, it's a good question, because it used to be years ago when I worked out in the Cape, our SROs were Cape Coral police officers, because at that time that's the way it worked. The city took care of the city, in Fort Myers, and then same thing in Cape Coral. Sanibel took care of Sanibel. Then back in, I believe, I want to say 2010, somewhere along that, 2010, 11, somewhere. We had both the cities pulled out on us, and the reason is because they were lacking funding. Both the city of Fort Myers and Cape Coral pulled out of our schools. Now the situation has changed. They have a real interest, for the reasons you stated, really, to get back in our schools. And I won't say that we're reluctant. Our healthy skepticism, and I shouldn't even say skepticism, but we have to go into this with eyes wide open, because we don't want to repeat what happened back in 2010. So that's why we've opened up those conversations with Chief Newland and Chief Diggs. Our intention moving forward is that we will probably have to build some type of a hybrid model, and as we build it, one of the things that has to be really clear is how do we handle those specific situations, and as it relates to communication, and we have to actually codify that, and so that all parties agree to this is the way that we are going. These are our standard operating procedures. We didn't have those standard operating procedures before, and so as a result we had some miscommunication that took place. We've learned from that, and so that's our intention, and why you see these gentlemen meeting, and eventually for the purpose of bringing the sheriff with the police, sheriff's department deputies with the police, to Captain Miller and company, working with Chief Diggs to actually iron out how this is going to work. We think that that we could actually build a model that could be something that would be an exemplary model that could be used in other places. And the reason I say that, and the reason I'm optimistic about that, I should say, is that having spoken with each one of these chiefs and the sheriff, they all like each other. They all get along, and philosophically, there's a lot of alignment. Now, as Mr. Parfit said, there is also that each agency, is very proud of its own, its own organization, and there is some reluctance to share information, but we hope to break down those barriers because our schools are where all that intersects. Some of our schools, I was at a school when I was at Paul Lawrence Dunbar Middle School when I was off Edison. You had, which is where Dunbar High School is today, you have a lot of intersection between the county and the city. So, often if you're talking bus stops and kids walking there, things happen in that kind of that, that zone where you're right between both entities' boundaries, and it gets to be a little tricky. But if you're working really well together, that's easy to overcome.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now we'll briefly hear from Mary Fisher.
Good evening. I thought you'd have a lot more questions for Mr. Parfit and Dr. Atkins. So I have some information about the Constitutional Review Commission, about attending the Golden Apple celebration, and about some of the updates from our student advisory. But considering the conversation that has taken place, and I have some notes in response to some of the things, I'll write those up and have those sent with the minutes. It's very brief. So I know that our school resource officers are certified law enforcement personnel and that they take a special 40-hour training. And most of them have an interest in working with kids. And I know that we have recently had more deputies assigned to the schools who do not have that training. So that's a concern for me. I know that the funding from the state, $400 million statewide, I heard from a community member today that breaks down to about a little more than $12,000 per school. And it's not sustainable. It's for now, but who knows about next year. So I loved what Mr. Parfit said about the human factor, because from our student advisory, we heard that they don't want to go to school in a jail, that they don't think that fences and metal detectors and that kind of thing are going to solve the problem, that it's really a problem that has to do with people. And they said that they thought that they have to watch out for one another, they have to be aware of their surroundings. They had a lot of really good suggestions. Now, as a former school counselor, I know that many of our school counselors are also licensed mental health counselors. Many of our school social workers are licensed clinical social workers also. Our nurses have trauma and crisis training, as do many of our psychologists. So I'm hoping that as we move forward, we're going to look at utilizing those people who have that expertise more on a steady basis in the schools, because they can help with threat assessment for sure. And we used to provide crisis intervention training and many trainings that were pertinent to the mental health professionals to our student services personnel, and I hope that we will again resurrect that and have them current and certified and trained so that we can address the issues that might arise. I don't think that we want our kids to go to school and be fearful. I think that we want them to, like they say, be aware of their surroundings. And a lot of times it's about building that culture where the school is like a big family. And for many of our kids, school is the safest place they know. I was talking to a young teacher who was telling me that in her class, she had 4 homeless kids, and several other children. It was more than half of her class who were involved in some kind of trauma, that their families were involved with the Department of Children and Families, and that sometimes makes it difficult for them to be ready to settle down and learn. So utilizing the people who have the training and the direct relationships with the kids, I think, is going to be one important factor as we move forward. And I guess I can tell you a little bit about, on another note, about the Constitutional Review Commission. One of the proposals that passed the Constitutional Review Committee consisted of 3 formally separate proposals relating to civic literacy, so requiring civics training in school, which I'm totally in agreement with that. They also have passed the school board term limits, which means that school board members would only serve 2 terms, and I technically agree with that. And the creation of a state charter school authorizer, which would take away some of the authority that individual school districts now have in monitoring charter schools. And that part concerns me a little bit because of the fact that we need some oversight, because when there is an issue with a charter school, we need to be ready to provide a seat and a teacher for the children, if that's the case. So we want to keep our eye on the legislation that's coming forward and make sure that we communicate with our legislative delegation and our county commission. And I think that is about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Okay, time to go to the breakout group. Since we finished up the presentations a little early, we'll come back from breakouts at 7:30. And the gentlemen will rotate to different breakout groups, starting with elementary. Okay, welcome back from the breakout groups. The first group I think we'll hear from tonight is the high school group.
We shared a lot of the safety implementation that's been occurring in the high schools, how we have already seen a lot of the progress that's already, they talked about last meeting. We've seen it being implemented. There was a couple of little hiccups, but at the same time, they were representative of how they are in the process of working and making the improvements. We talked about metal detectors and why they kind of came to the conclusion that they might not be worth it, that the kids would eventually figure out how to get around them anyway, so they might not be worth the expense. We did decide that mental health was a requirement for the safety of the schools, but not in a mental illness kind of way, but with coping skills, and that the children might not know how to cope. So therefore, we were asking, and we asked the gentleman when they came in about having more money for guidance counselors and social workers rather than SROs, and getting full-time social workers in all schools. We also discussed the access control cards that are supposed to be coming, I believe they said to all schools, not just all high schools, but the staff would have the access cards to get in and out rather than just keys. And we made a request for Racine Monroe to come and discuss the social work and how the social workers are being implemented in the high schools at this point.
Thank you. Okay, middle school.
It's worth a shot. We had a general question about the glass in the hallways and stairwells of the schools, where some of the schools have hurricane resistant, but there was a question as to whether or not it was bulletproof, and is there a concern about how lots of windows impact school safety? Another question that we addressed with the folks, I'll shorten it, is general policy about what happens if a student makes some sort of threat or there's an issue with a student at one particular school and there's a decision because of that. And it was explained that if a child makes a threat and the threat's found to be credible, that child won't be placed in another one of our schools. They'll be dealt with in another manner. But if for some reason a child is moved from one school to another, how is that information spread to the parents of the second school? What happened in this particular instance is the children in the second school found out about it very rapidly. They're then upset and talking to their parents, and the parents had no idea what was going on. So there's a question about what is the school board's policy for how that's handled and what type of information is or is not disseminated. There was also a question about what process the school board and/or law enforcement goes through to determine how credible a threat is if a student has made one at a school. We had a question about the single point of entry plan intended for schools for both when the students are arriving and departing, or is it just after the kids are in class and it's for during the day? Question of concern about the choke point it creates and whether all the schools can handle the influx and outflux of their students through a single point of entry. There was a question asked as well. There was a mention in the presentation about having a private police force or something to that degree of some of the schools, and they asked what is the difference in size between the districts that do have that type of police force and ours. Separate question, we had a lot of questions. Has a consideration been given to having supplemental or sort of like a private security firm providing armed security, and what would be the cost impact of that? Would that be something that's more financially feasible than funding law enforcement officers? But obviously there's some a pro-con analysis that needs to go along with that. What is the process for teachers and or administrators to receive mental health and/or crisis/trauma training? Is there a plan in place to get more people trained? It was mentioned that there was training and things available. In our group, at least, it was said there were probably a number of teachers that would be interested in taking that kind of training, but it sounds like teachers in our district aren't sure how to apply or request that type of training. So that's a question. And last but not least, do we have a system in place to train substitute teachers about how to handle a crisis in the particular school? And does any given substitute teacher have what they would need to implement that? So in other words, if they're at a school where it's necessary to move from a classroom to a more secure room, does the substitute teacher have the key or access card given to them when they arrive so they're able to access that? Anecdotally, it sounds like today that may not be true. Substitutes aren't always provided with that access, so the substitute could be teaching a class where the protocol is to take the children out of that class to somewhere else, and the substitute teacher literally doesn't have the wherewithal to do that. So what's the process for that? Those were our questions.
Thank you. Okay, elementary.
Sorry, we're late. We were a very active group tonight. My co-chair has resigned, and we have a wonderful volunteer. Cedric B. Hall will now be co-chairing the elementary group. Wonderful, for the next few meetings. So that is item 1 on our list. We heard in this room and in our room a number of questions about the protocols and what the SROs were supposed to be doing, were allowed to be doing, where they were supposed to be, et cetera. And we had heard that the protocols had been issued. Some schools had had them, some schools had been discussed with, et cetera. And Jerry said that he will make sure that those protocols are reissued to the principals so that the principals can rediscuss them or discuss them for the first times with the staff, and then make sure that the information that needs to be distributed as to what the SROs can do, are supposed to be doing, et cetera, does get down the line the way it is supposed to go. There were questions about the amount of time an SRO should be doing their public school activities. And I say public school activities because there were questions about how much time some of the schools are sharing SROs with charter schools. And there was a question about half and half, or they're supposed to be giving preference to the public schools, and we need that answered. And also there was a question about how much time they were actually spending in their office or in their car versus doing their actual public school activities. And that is an outstanding question. And then the last question we had asked actually after the group, but we think it's one that the whole group should have answered, is will there be SROs at the schools with summer programs this year? Pretty outstanding question for the elementary group, so thank you.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any public comment from non-DAC members about non-agenda items? Any good of the order? Okay. Okay, Scott has made a motion to adjourn, seconded by, okay, all in favor? See you next month.